And eventually we canceled the performance. We decided to play something else. And I felt so bad about that. And like a complete failure, and sort of at the beginning of your career and thinking, well, this is it. I'm never going to get asked to do anything again.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology.
So I came across a quote a number of years ago that always sort of stuck with me because on the one hand, it's a very obvious statement, but at the same time hints at something a little deeper, more profound as well. And so the quote, you've probably heard it, was a black belt is a white belt who never quit. And so the part of this that always stuck with me is not so much the never quitting part, but more the part about how the black belt that we see in front of us right now, who seems to know so much and has such enviable skills, once upon a time struggled with the same white belt challenges that we might be facing right now and likely experienced the same frustrations that we might currently be experiencing and made the same mistakes we might be making and so on. And so the trouble, of course, is that it's difficult for us to imagine this because we can only imagine this black belt as they are now, not as they were in the past. And so I bring this up because you've been playing the piano for nearly your entire life and began performing at a young age as well. But I want to imagine that there may have been times in the past, some ups and downs along the ways and moments where you didn't do things as effectively or as efficiently as you might now. So I guess my question that I thought we could start with is, was there a time where you weren't quite as sure about what to do in the practice room? And if so, I'd love to kind of start there and hear what you remember about what those times look like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would start off by saying those times never end. A black belt, it still has things to learn. And part of that attitude of, the fact that there is no ending to learning, as Schumann said, is, I think, how you get there in the first place. Is this acceptance of the fact that there's always more you can be understanding and taking in. I love your framing of this because I often say to my students, who are now in a similar position maybe to how I was, because there they are at the Juilliard School, and so was I. And I say, of the students we went to school with, the ones who are still doing this are the ones who are still doing this. Right. So it's the ones who kind of the whole time, every time something told them maybe it's time to take another turn, or maybe they don't know something, or maybe they shouldn't keep pursuing in this way, they figured out a way to persist. They figured out a way to stay in it. And some of that comes from, it's an internal drive. Some of it comes from something that we might define as passion, although I would not say that the people who leave are necessarily less passionate. But there's a kind of a belief that you will figure more out. There's a certain amount of faith, right, and trust in persisting. There's also, as I tell my students who are closer to the real world, like the second-year master's students, there's also the having an economic cushion, where you felt like, okay, if I don't make a lot of money this year, I can still eat. And so knowing that you can get past those moments is also kind of a crucial part of it. All of that to preface, of course I remember those moments, right? There's always those, you encounter a new piece or a new composer's language, and you just think to yourself, oh my God, I don't even know. And maybe I'll start by telling you a story of when I didn't get it right, because that left a big impact on me. And I remember I'm going to say I was 20 years old. That sounds about right to me. And I was going to a festival in Spoleto in Italy, and it was a professional gig. I was getting paid, and I had been there before, and I was asked to learn a particular work of contemporary chamber music. And I was not equipped. I hadn't been taught to learn that kind of music. I didn't have enough experience at the time. It's so funny for me to think of that now, because now I've done so much of that at this point, but I was just clueless. I didn't even know how to begin learning the notes. And I struggled, and I tried to prepare myself as best I could. And I just felt like I wasn't getting any closer to it as the gig came closer to the date. And I got on the plane to do this concert date, still very nervous, thinking, how am I I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have this yet. And then getting there, starting rehearsals, realizing that these rehearsals were not going at all like any other rehearsals that I had ever had before, because I was not bringing it. I was the one. Maybe the other players weren't helping either, but I knew exactly where my failings were on that one. And eventually we canceled the performance. We decided to play something else. And I felt so bad about that. And like a complete failure, and sort of at the beginning of your career and thinking, well, this is it, I'm never going to get asked to do anything again. And yeah, we made the best of a bad situation. I don't remember what we changed the repertoire to. The concert was a huge success. I know the presenter was very upset that we lost that particular piece because, of course, they had a personal connection to that composer, which I hadn't realized at the beginning. And I set about asking myself, well, what should I have known? What should I have understood to begin to tackle what this is? And that set off a very long process. And I was actually coincidentally just speaking with one of my students about this week. She was very frustrated that certain repertoire just doesn't come as easily to her as others. And she's maybe in her early mid-20s. And I told her, the end of that process, or that it's not the end, a definition point in that process for me was maybe somewhere in my late 20s when I suddenly, being asked to play things and taking on gigs and repertoire that maybe was new. I mean, the piano repertoire is endless. And I remember hitting a moment somewhere around the age of maybe 27, 28, 29, something like that, where I said, you know what? I can learn anything. And it was just, that process had taken almost a decade from total failure. I mean, total failure to drawing on everything that I had been taught, everything that I had learned, and just constantly pelting this problem with small versions of solutions, things that I felt would drive me towards where I wanted to be. And then one day sitting and, being asked to play something that was completely new and saying, you know what, I have all the tools. I know how to learn this. Might be hard for me, might not be my best piece ever, but I now know how to learn any piece of music. And that was a hugely rewarding feeling to get from the one to the other. And just to be clear, at the time, I had no idea this was a straight line trajectory that I was following and a path that I was actually consciously getting to. But the reality is that that's how it functioned.
I was reading something that was written about you, or that you had written yourself, perhaps, about performing some work of John Adams. And I think you maybe had been the second pianist to perform it. And then afterwards he came up and maybe whispered something in your ear, saying something like, you get it, like you like understand it.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can say more about, because this seems to be related to what you're talking about with this contemporary chamber work, which I'm assuming you're not talking about like understanding how to put one note after the other and play the notes that are on the score, but just not understanding the meaning of it or like what it's all about. And in that sort of same sense that John Adams was referring to, I wonder if it's possible for you to elaborate on that a little bit, to kind of say a little bit more about like what that means to get a work.
Sure. I mean, let me talk specifically about that. So I've played a number of John Adams pieces. He's one of my favorite composers to play at this point. And I think I can say the feeling is sort of mutual. And I've played, pretty much every note he's written for the piano, and even recorded grand pianola music with him conducting. But this was the first piece of his that I was playing in a big public way, and it was Century Rolls, his first piano concerto. And I'll tell you one really important lesson from that terrible chamber experience that I took to that performance. I started much earlier. I started the process of putting, like, I had heard the piece. I actually heard when Manny X played it in, I think it was in Carnegie Hall with Dohnányi, would have been the New York premiere of the piece. And I remember at that moment, I just fell in love with the piece instantly. And I immediately went to my manager and I said, I'm next. Can you find me a date to play this? And then I just immediately started working on it. And I was relentless and I was consistent and I was dedicated, maybe even to a point I had never been dedicated to any other piece of music before, because I think I knew that this was going to be a big lift and very different from what I was used to in terms of the way you concentrate, the way you think about rhythm, how things have to be internalized in order to even begin to function so that you can then rise above them and make beautiful music. And I pursued it this in all the years. So you're talking to me from my apartment. In all the years I've lived in this apartment, I've been here since 1998. I only really ever had one complaint about my practicing, and it was while I was preparing this piece. I clearly I was just, going in for months. And that shift in understanding myself and my process and how long I would need for a particular work in order to put it in, that was a huge moment of self-awareness, right? If they had asked me even at that age, at that stage in my career, if somebody had said, "Oh, play this Mozart concerto," I would say, "Sure, a few weeks, right? It will be fine." The understanding that this one was going to take 6 months was a moment of great growth for me and maturity, and also understanding where my standards were, what I needed them to be in order to make something like this work, and just giving myself the pacing of what it was going to take. So when I started to learn it, I remember the combination of the notes and the rhythms, and I'd never come across anything like this in my life, was too much. I could either do the notes or I could do the rhythms. And at first, the minute I tried to put rhythms in with the notes would fall off. The minute I tried to put notes in with the rhythms, the other would fall off. So I was just very, very patient. I mean, this expression is highly overused, but I think in this moment, it's exactly the right expression. I learned to trust the process. Whereas before, I think I had always forced the process. And that worked fine for me up to a certain point. My teachers had taught me things and I spat them out, and I was lucky enough that it worked. But this was a moment where I had to really trust that if I did this consistently for long enough in these healthy ways, making sure to sometimes work on the rhythm, sometimes work on the notes, put them together, listen to the piece, take it in, and that at one point it would flip over and I would be able to go past. And that point of flipping over with that music, especially at that time for me, when it was still such a new concept for me, that point of flipping over took much, much longer with this piece than with anything else that I had played up to that point. So then to get to the point where, fast forward, and we're playing the concerts, and we performed it a couple of times in St. Louis. This was with the St. Louis Symphony, but John Adams couldn't be there for any of those. He couldn't even make it to the dress rehearsal in Carnegie. And so the first time that I was playing the piece for him was at the performance in Carnegie Hall. So talk about, pressure, mostly that I was putting on myself, right? And to have him come on stage, and as we're accepting the applause, he just, turned to me and said, "You got it. You really got it." I mean, that's just such a career highlight. But it represented so much work. Incremental work.
Maybe this is a trade secret, as it were, but could you say a little bit more about what your process looks like from the time that you're given a new piece, not something that you've heard your whole life, but something that's really new to you, and maybe there are recordings, maybe there aren't, and maybe the way you approach it is different if there is versus if there isn't, or if there's only one, for instance. But I wonder if you could say more about that, because I remember a time where when I was young, obviously, I thought, well, just listen to a bunch of recordings and then you play things with the right rhythm and tune with a good sound, and then you're good, right?
Yeah.
But then later on, when I started seeing, musicians really take a look at the score and pull ideas, even if they've never played it before, studied it before, they can see things that they then say, what about this, or try this, have you thought about this? And that just sort of made me feel like a complete beginner again, because I was like, oh, well, crap, I don't know anything about how to learn a piece of music.
Isn't that the best feeling, though?
Right. Well, that part wasn't so fun, but then getting to the point where I understood, it's like, oh, that's what they were doing. That's what they're looking for, et cetera. That felt like, okay, now I have some sense of, I'm not just lost in the woods, having no idea what direction to go in. But yeah, I mean, could you talk a little bit about what that looks like for you, and parts of it that maybe you share with your own students?
Sure. When a piece is completely foreign to me, a composer I don't know at all, a world premiere, I confess I do like hearing it. So if there's a MIDI mock-up at the beginning, I will take that. I take it with a very, very large grain of salt, because of course the MIDI mock-ups are notoriously unmusical. Their tempos are distorted, and even the composers will distort the tempi on those because since it's not a real acoustic instrument, it's not doing what it is that the composer ultimately wants the music to be able to do. But I do use that as a little bit of it's a little bit like language immersion, to just come in and be able to hear the language and put it in the ear. I try not to use it too much, even in that context. And in the context, if it's a piece, if it's a composer I know, if I'm going to learn another Brahms song, I go straight to the score. I completely eschew recordings at this point in my life. That said, look, I've been doing this professionally for more than 30 years. I've heard a lot of things. And I think the process, that initial process of curiosity and listening to lots of stuff, whether or not it's something you're about to play, that was a crucial part of my formation. I think a lot of times students now, if you say to them, oh, don't listen to the recording, go straight to the score, they don't really get it because they haven't yet had that experience of just listening to a lot of pieces and therefore knowing what you're going to find in that score. Even long before recordings existed, budding performers went to lots of concerts. And as they continued learning, of course, they would approach a new piece and start maybe that from scratch if they hadn't heard it. But they would have heard so many things that they could reference as they're looking at that score. They would have had so much context for that score. So that's why I say I will listen to a recording if I have no context for a composer, or if, for a particular time period in a composer's life or something like that. I will look a little bit for some context. Then I actually kind of put a ban on listening to anybody else's performances for a really long time, pretty much until I'm almost ready to go. Until I feel I have an interpretation, until I feel I have some understanding of how the piece works, how it does what it's setting out to do, how I want it to sound in different moments. And then at the very end of that process, maybe even the week of performance or a couple of days before performance, then I might listen to a bunch of recordings of people I trust, people that I know I have often appreciated for their performances of this particular composer or of something within this time frame. And then I just think, okay, is there anything huge that I, in my brilliant stupidity, have completely missed that I might glean from these other performances? But by then, my own overall sense of what I want is really quite well grounded and also very solid from an ego point of view. I mean, I know this is something that I know you think about a lot. If you're feeling very fragile, a performance could knock you right out, and then you feel like you've got nothing. So I don't even do that until I'm feeling pretty solid about what I've decided with a piece. And then I might listen to somebody go, oh, wow, there's another color in this section that, although I've thought about this section and what it means, it never even occurred to me to bring this kind of color out of it. That kind of thing will certainly influence that last bit of the process.
You've given yourself some perhaps new inspirations or options when you listen to these other recordings kind of near the performance date. Do you then allow yourself to indulge in experimenting a little bit with that in the last couple of days? I guess part of my question is I'm curious what you do in the last few days, because you don't want to over practice, obviously, but you do want to stay connected to the piece and to the instrument and so forth. And I'm wondering if that's part of what you do in the last few days, or do you have like a process for kind of peaking at the right time, as it were?
Yeah, I think experimenting is exactly the right word for it, right? So if you feel like you have a solid enough foundation, then you can try a little this, try a little that. I would even add to that as pianists, we often do some of that the day of the concert, especially if we don't get to try that piano before that day. So you'll suddenly come to an instrument and, oh, this one does that up here. Maybe I can use that to achieve what it was that I was trying to get at in this space. I'm sitting in front of my piano right now and I'm looking towards this register, which is like octave above middle C and higher, because that's usually the one where suddenly a piano will surprise you and be capable of either a particular kind of brightness or a sort of rounded tone that maybe you had hoped for, but weren't sure you could count on. So there is that, right? This having this, again, this solid foundation where you feel, I know what I want to do here. I know, but I can do this or that to change it. And I actually like to be in that experimental mode when I get to performance, because that's what performance is all about. You come to that moment and here's this audience and you're creating something for them at that moment. It's very different than recording, which is also a kind of performance, but it has a completely different way of thinking about it. But a live performance is exactly this in the moment interaction between you and a listener, where you're gauging listening, where you're gauging the space, where you're gauging the instrument, where you're gauging the pacing of the program, and maybe changing little things based on that in order to communicate even more deeply what you've already decided are the core things to communicate about the works you're playing.
So one of the questions that I'm always keen to ask folks who perform a lot is, what are you thinking about on stage, or what are you focused on stage? And a lot of times the immediate response to that is, I'm thinking about the music, which is sort of, it's true, but oftentimes it's so kind of vague or abstract, a response that it's hard for students to take action on it, or for others to take action on that. So yeah. I wonder, and it's surely going to be different when you're performing as a soloist with orchestra versus when you're playing a solo recital yourself, or when you're in a chamber ensemble. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about, because it's different on a bad day than it is on a good day, so maybe more on a good day. What are you, or actually maybe you could tell us what's going through your mind on a bad day, and then contrast it with what's happening or what you're deliberately focused on a good day.
This is something that my students and I talk about all the time. Actually, I teach some piano performance classes at Juilliard, and I take the fact that they're called piano performance classes really seriously. We talk about performing all the time in philosophical ways. And thinking about the music is one thing. Sometimes you may have heard teachers say, oh, make sure you're listening, right? Active listening in the moment, which is some aspect of thinking about the music. And I think very, very true. So reacting to, not to what you dreamt would come out of the instrument, but to what's actually happening at that moment in that room. And again, for pianists, especially with that instrument, what is it doing differently than you were thinking of? But I also think that what we do, and this is probably the thing I love the most about what we do is the ultimate act of empathy. First, it's our job to be as empathetic as possible to the composer and to put ourselves in their place and to have a sense of what they might have been thinking. This is why it's so important to have context on their lives, on their music, on the time period they were living in. Why did they think this would land the way they clearly thought it would land? So there's that process of empathy, that's really the whole learning process. And then there's the empathy with your audience, which is the second crucial component to that. When you're playing, you're communicating. Well, who are you communicating to? You already know what you're saying, right? So the audience is there, whether that audience is in person, on a live stream, so happening at the same time but far away, or it's a recording that goes out to a completely different audience. There's a perceived audience who you're trying to sort of hold the hand of and say, I think this is how this piece works. I think this is how this piece communicates. I think these are the emotions that are in here, and this is the order that you should feel them in, and the intensity. And I'm trying to take you, and I don't want to get too precise about that, because the whole point about music is that it's not that precise. That's why it's so effective. It's less articulate than putting a word here or there. But I'm in a concert situation, I'm often really mentally putting myself over there in the audience. What am I hearing? What have they communicated? What are they showing me? If it's solo, it's one thing, but if it's a collaboration with orchestra or with chamber players, I'm thinking about, are the balances from there what they need to be? Are they hearing what they need to hear? My husband, who, among other things, teaches conducting, always talks to his students about, for a conductor, how important it is to ask yourself the question, what do they need to see? Right? So in the orchestra, what are the musicians, what are they looking for from you? And I take that question and add it to this performance and say, what do they need to hear? What do the people who are listening to this piece, presumably fresh, maybe for the first time, maybe not, whatever it is, what do they need to hear in order to understand the piece as I would like to convey to them? And I'm thinking about that a lot. Thinking is maybe not the right word, though. Maybe it's feeling. I'm feeling that a lot. I think if it gets too deep into articulate thinking, then you play wrong notes. And you do have to divide your brain between those two tasks.
Yeah, there's a quote that's often attributed to John Cage, I believe, but actually is one of the rules in a classroom that Sister Karita Kent, artist, put up. She said you should never try to analyze and create at the same time, because they're different processes. And it sounds a little bit like that divide that you're describing in that moment.
I mean, I love that, because that also hits to another thing that I talk with my students about all the time, which is when you're practicing, you should live in the present and in the past. You should be thinking about, oh, what just happened? Oh, how do I fix that? Let me go back and work on it. Let me analyze. And then let me play it and listen to it in real time. When you're performing, you should be in the present and maybe the very immediate future. That's it. That's the window of time that you should be living in. So I love that. You can't do both at that same time.
Does that then imply some use of recording yourself when you're preparing for things? I'm wondering how that fits into the whole equation, because I think most students, for obvious reasons that I think we can all appreciate, avoid recording as much as possible, or save it until it's kind of too late, or record but don't like to listen back, etc. But I'm wondering how you address that with students and how you use that yourself.
It's funny. I feel like that's changed, since the days when you and I were students. I think students are recording themselves all the time now. And I ask them, do you really listen? They say they do. And maybe it's a generational thing. There are points in the process where I do think recording is good. I think they're earlier on, generally. I feel like, and this is something maybe you can even help me articulate, because it's something I've been trying to articulate for a long time. I feel like my ears are now at a point where when I am playing, I am listening to that recording. So what does that mean? I'm objective enough that I'm listening from the outside to what's actually happening, and I've separated physically or physiologically in the way that my brain is processing the information. I've separated the mechanical part of what I'm doing to create it from the maybe intellectual part of trying to hear it and then process all that. Not to say that that's perfect. Sometimes I will listen to a recording, and even, when you're in the deep, like, studio recording process and you go back and listen back all the time, sometimes I'll hear and I'll say, oh, I didn't realize, But to be honest, at this point in my career, and I'd say for a long time now, that very rarely happens, because part of what I've done is kind of integrate those processes so that they happen at the same time. And it requires, in your practice, it requires a focus on the mechanics so that you can let them go so much more and leave yourself the brain room for the rest of it.
I've heard this from folks who have been at it for a long time, that at some point you get to a place where your perception of what you think happened is pretty closely aligned with what actually did happen. And I suspect that it's partly, like you described, something that happens over years, where you do a lot of recording and you listen back and you get a sense of, okay, when I do it this way, then this happens. And I think earlier on, before we've gone through that process, that a lot of times, in our student years, we think we're doing something, and then we listen back and it's not actually coming across, or we think we're not doing something and actually, we're rushing, or something's out of tune. Or
I have a really fun story, and I promise not to name names, but we happen to be talking just not long after all of my students who are seniors recorded their pre-screenings for the year. And for most of them, this is the first time, and certainly one of the first times, where they've really had to record themselves. And a crazy thing happens. Even before they go and listen back to the recording, suddenly their listening is completely different than what it's been in the whole time leading up to this moment. And of course, depending on the personality, some of them are taking all that in all along and kind of slowly, incrementally working. But every once in a while, you get a student who doesn't do that through the process, is kind of doing all the things they're supposed to be doing, but not actually taking that level of ownership of it, or and then they get in front of the microphone and they completely freeze up, because for the first time they're actually hearing themselves, and they realize, I may not be as prepared as I thought for this process. And what I love about that is, look, you're never a better pianist for that repertoire than the day after you recorded it. This is why, every time, even when I put out studio recordings, like the very next day, I'm like, oh, now I would do it so much better. Even if you've prepared using that method and using that kind of focused listening and putting yourself outside of the music a lot and hearing it, even then, the act of recording just heightens your awareness in a different way. But certainly for students starting out, so I would say for anybody who's getting ready to make sort of first recordings, think about that. Take your time. So we were saying before, but students recording themselves, sometimes they record themselves and they listen, but they haven't actually thought about what that means. And whether you do it through recording or just through listening, think about the fact that you will have this heightened focus and you're suddenly listening from the outside. That's what listening to your recording does, right? It disconnects you from the mechanics of trying to play the notes, and it puts you as a listener rather than as a performer. And that way of thinking is can be really foreign, especially, I would say, the harder the piece is for you physically, the more foreign that's going to be, because more of your brain is occupied with the mechanics of getting it in place. So thinking that way all through the preparation process is enormously helpful, so that when you get to that moment, you can actually take off and use that and just listen from the outside. But if the very first time you're listening in that way is in the performance, it's going to be a lot harder for you. And it happens all the time.
This makes me think a little bit about confidence, and you talked about in the John Adams performance being the first time and there being a little bit of pressure that you had put on yourself. And so, I mean, we don't know each other super well, but even from the very first time we met as kids, the key thing that always came across, to me at least, about you is you've always seemed very self-assured and just confident in who you are and sort of certain about who you are and embracing that fully. And I don't know, I mean, I could be totally wrong, but that's just kind of my impression, both on and off stage, I think. And so I guess what I was curious about is that your experience of yourself? And if so, how did you get to that point, or how did you cultivate, or how do you cultivate that? And if not, I think that's also really illustrative too, because sometimes we imagine people are a certain way and their internal experience is actually quite different. And either way, I'm sort of curious about what your impressions are.
It's funny. My teacher used to say, "That's acting." I definitely never experienced myself that way. I still don't. But what I do experience, and maybe this is what reflects, is I tend to be a person who, if I don't know anything, I won't say anything. I won't even opine, and I won't even have an opinion. I in fact, because I maybe display that kind of self-assurance, people often think I have an opinion, even when I don't, even when I haven't said anything. But so if I don't know, I tend not to share. If I'm sharing, it's because I've come to such a deep conclusion. I've thought something through so much, or I've internalized a piece of music. It still never feels like it's enough. I'm still always convinced that there's something big that I've missed. But I would say that's where that comes from, because then by the time I'm presenting on the stage, by the time I'm talking to you about this, and students, and the number of smaller conversations or of thought processes that have led to that moment have given me a certain sense that even if it's not necessarily a conviction that I'm right, it's a conviction about some truths. It's a conviction about some standards that feel like they are repeatable experiments, that they're not necessarily scientific truths, but they're as close as you can get to what that means in that context. So I think anybody can achieve that. part of that is kind of not faking it. Part of achieving it is not pretending you have it when you don't, because that is a completely different feeling of the experience. And of course, I'm not saying never. Life has all sorts of things that happen to you, but part of getting to that moment is not over preparation, but clear standards for where preparation lies. What is it that you need to have understood in order to be worthy of putting it out there? What is that minimum? And I say the minimum because I think we always all feel like there's a whole lot more we could be putting in to it. There's nobody, I don't think there's anybody that you would hear after a performance coming out and saying, that was perfect, we're good. All done now. So that part doesn't change. But having come to a place where I said, I've thought about so many things here that I feel ready to share that out. I think that's a lot of where that comes from. Maybe it comes from having been a third child. So, I had two very, very old, very, very smart and wise older brothers who just knew better about everything. And so I learned not to speak until I had something reasonably meaningful to say.
So I'm really curious about this minimum enough point, and you articulated it much more eloquently than that. But because I think sometimes students will come to me and have questions centered around, how do I know when it's enough? Because like you said, we realized the day after the recording that, I could have done this differently, or I wish I would have thought about this a little bit more. And there's never a final resting point for any of these things. Every time we come back to something, we see something new, and it's like, what was I thinking last time? How do you, for yourself, define, especially because you're having to get up and perform in front of a lot of people, but then there are time and energy constraints and kids and so forth. So how do you define that for yourself? Or has that point changed maybe even over time?
There are two sides to that question that I want to pick up on. I love that question. I think about it all the time. One is something that I learned from my incredible producer, Erica Brenner, who I've made most of my recordings with over the years. And when we get into the editing process after recordings, usually there's producers come in with like we'll do 2 rounds of editing, or, they usually have a set number. But if they like you, if you work well together, they might do a couple of extra things if you're requesting them. And Erica always says, Orli, we're done editing when we say we're done editing. And that is so wise, because it tells you both sides of it. It says you could keep editing forever. And also at some point you have to let it go and put it out there. That same concept absolutely works for live performance. I have always, I think a lesson I learned, maybe starting from that contemporary piece that I, did so poorly on when I was 20, maybe from then on, but I think there was more than just that concert that taught me that lesson, is that you have to feel that you have prepared the best you could. And over the years, I've refined that to, okay, well, the best I could, that's like a philosophical, well, that's the best there is, right? The best I could is the best there is. So now I say the best you could under the circumstances. You have to take into account the circumstances. Were the circumstances you only found out about this concert 2 days ago? Were the circumstances that you were sick, a couple days ago? But even within the context, so that's not an excuse. If you were sick the last 2 days, but you didn't prepare the 2 weeks before, that's on you, right? So this question of the best you could under the circumstances, and therefore it's time to go out and play it. That has helped me a lot. And that mindset, when I get very nervous, which I still do, always have, sometimes that's excited nervous, but sometimes it's just nervous before going on stage. I ask myself, did I prepare the best I could? And if the answer is yes, under the circumstances, and if the answer is yes, that completely changes the attitude, sort of the physiological attitude with which I go out on stage. I think it probably changes my heart rate. Like if you were to measure, whatever various hormones coming out from my sweat glands, I think they change when the answer to that question is yes, I have. I've prepared the best I could under these circumstances.
I read an interview in which you had acknowledged or described yourself as being a bit of an overthinker, and I was wondering if that related more to your life off stage, or if that maybe even related to your tendencies when performing or practicing as well. And if so, I'm curious, like, how do you get out of your own way on stage? How do you stay focused on the things that, in that tiny window that you described is where you need to keep your mind? Because I think a lot of times it's easy for distracting thoughts to pop in, or concerns or nerve-related thoughts to pop in. And I'm wondering if you have any strategies or some sense of how you do that for yourself when you need to.
Yeah, I think we've touched actually on a bunch. And on some level, I would say I've overthought how to get out of overthinking, right? Telling myself in a concert, this doesn't happen so often anymore. I have to say, I feel so lucky that it doesn't. But for example, at first coming out of COVID, when live performances came back, I had to reteach myself some of those things. Some of the distractions would come in a slightly stronger way than they had before, reminding myself that this is happening in the present and the very immediate future is really helpful. So just a little bit of consciousness about not now, this doesn't come in now. It's something that I actually practice in every aspect of my life these days. And I think you and I are both parents. I think people, when you have kids, simultaneously two things happen. One is you're distracted all the time. And the other is you don't have a choice but to absolutely shut those things out at some moments to get things done. And so having those, and I think the same works even if you have a dog, frankly. There's also all sorts of, maybe if you're a teacher, when you have students, any kind of situation where things are competing for your attention all the time and are potentially even dangerous, like they actually require your attention, I think forces you to come to terms within yourself. When do I let that in and when do I not let that in? I think this is something people struggle with in their daily lives all the time. It's so common for us now, even with things like our phones. I mean, I see my students sometimes come into lessons. I highly encourage use of an iPad for your scores for certain situations, because I think it's really great to be able to put the music desk down and hear yourself the way the outside is hearing the piano. But they tell me, oh, I've turned my sound off so nothing will disturb me. But the little notifications pop while they're playing their music. And I tell them, look, if you don't practice not being distracted, you won't know how to not be distracted. And so, yes, in a concert setting, maybe those notifications won't pop up, but you won't know what it feels like to not be distracted. And so when that creeping thought comes in, you won't have anything to rely on, to draw on. What does it feel to be completely present, completely in this right now? And I have to say that I've been very lucky in my life, especially maybe in the past 10 years or so. Being present has become so natural to me in every context that I'm in, whatever it is that I'm doing. Maybe it's because I'm overly busy and I don't have a choice. That part's really wonderful. So being able to say, no, now we're doing this, and that's what we're doing. It's no longer as difficult as I think it was for me when I was younger. I think when I was younger, any little thing would take me out of that. But at the same time, as a musician, I was also very lucky, and you know this, that we were already practicing being present, even if we weren't great at it. And even, during those younger years where, your focus was only a few seconds at a time, just learning, I was thinking of when my son was learning beginning Suzuki violin, just thinking of being fully focused on that bow as you go on the A string, not to touch the E or the D, and to keep it straight and not to accidentally let the violin slip. Just that level of attentiveness to what is happening right now is already a lesson that, we're very lucky as musicians. It's part of what we get to have all the time. And honing that further is is not nearly as hard as getting it in the first place.
Speaking of learning things, you've had the opportunity to collaborate with and play with and study with and learn from a lot of folks over the years. Um, and obviously, I'm always curious about, what you learned from your teachers, but maybe in the time that we have, I'm actually a little more curious. What are some of the most influential things that you've learned from people who don't play the piano that you've incorporated into your own music making and preparation and practice and so forth?
Yeah, I love that question. There are probably quite a few even deeper things that are more long-term. Like I grew up with scientist parents. You heard me mention repeatable experiments, earlier. I think that way of thinking, that scientific way of thinking about things is a part of everything that I do. This question of not just leaving things to chance, but kind of understanding the mechanics behind them and how does that, is that something you can do again and again? Is it something you can rely on? That's something I've learned a lot. More recently, I would say there are two strands of things that I've been thinking about a whole lot in the past few years. One is collaboration and how collaboration works. I've been very lucky, deeply, I would say, in this past year, to be a board chair at an institution that I'm really passionate about, the Kaufman Music Center, whose mission is this sort of intersection of education and access. And in my capacity in that role, which is, by the way, a role I never imagined for myself and never thought that, I never prepared for, never studied for, other than the fact that I have knowledge of how the field works. I've had to do a lot of collaboration in all sorts of different levels with people. And taking that back to, and also bringing into it what it means to collaborate with other musicians, whether it be the sort of individual members in an orchestra, so where it's a bigger setting, but there are individuals speaking out in some way in that communication, or in chamber music setting, or how you even communicate something to students in a verbal way. I find that the world without the musical part illuminates certain aspects of how communication needs to work that I can then take to the musical part of it. That's one side of it. The other big thing that I have been learning really for the past 10 years is how our bodies work. I've been working with a personal trainer who specializes in corrective exercises. I had scoliosis even as a kid, so people who knew me when I was like 14, all they remember about me is that I was in physical therapy. I was lucky not to have hand injuries so much, but I had everything else, ached and didn't work right, and I was out of alignment. And giving birth to twins didn't help any of that. So after that time, I started working with somebody on a regular basis, and we've been working so closely that I've learned so much about her, about things that sports trainers know about how the human body works. This one thing I'll say it to you. To you, it's probably so obvious, but I just didn't know this, that it takes about 6 weeks to learn to retrain the body for a new physical routine. This is why when you get your physical therapy prescription, it's pretty much always for 6 weeks. Understanding that from the combination of your brain, your nervous system, and the musculature necessary to develop a new habit, translating that to the piano has been very revealing and incredibly useful to think about time frames. For example, in teaching, if I give a student something, I'm quite cognizant of that 6-week period and where are they within that time frame. And I felt like such an idiot because every athlete, like for decades, has known about about more or less that time frame, but nobody ever taught me that about music. So taking that has been very helpful.
I have one last question, and I don't actually know where this is going to go or if it's going to work out or not. So we'll see. But so you and I have this mutual friend whose name I'll leave out of this just in case you would prefer to be left out of it. But I was actually tempted to reach out to her and ask her what she thought I should ask you, given that she's known you forever. And so I'm wondering, I didn't actually, but I'm wondering, like, if I had, what would she have told me that I should ask you?
I would say this, probably, I don't know what she would have said that she would have asked, but I would take the question and turn it around. So we're talking about probably my closest friend since childhood, who is a fellow pianist. And what I would tell you is that her and my discussions about process over these years form the backbone of everything else that I do. Right? I mean, I've talked about these things with teachers. I'm lucky enough to have many musicians in my family. We talk about from different points of view. She is my pianist go-to. How do you do this? And over the years, we've been at different places in terms of how many concerts are we playing right now? How much teaching are we doing? How much time are we dedicating to raising our kids? And we've always been like, like little circles, like more here, more there, but we switch off. And that changes, and what that is has been hugely helpful for me in articulating my own thoughts. I think having one person or a couple of people with whom you could be brutally honest, but everything that scares the living daylights out of you is really useful. And she's been that person for me. I know that those conversations have furthered my thinking and furthered my ability to handle where I am enormously during that time. I hope the same has been true for her.
It sounds like, practice buddy doesn't really, that word doesn't do this justice, but it sounds like having that sort of person in your life that you can bounce ideas off of, discuss things with, and use as sort of a mirror in some ways as well. It sounds like that's a really valuable thing that I've heard other musicians talk about, having that sort of a person or presence in their life as well, and how valuable that's been. So, and it don't know that we all have one, but
well, I was going to say it could be a mentor, it can be a teacher, up to a certain point, and beyond that, it's something you cultivate. I think it's not, when we were younger, I don't think we talked about those things, right? But it's something that at some point we both realized, wait a second, I have somebody here who gets that. Let's talk about it. That's a conscious realization. It doesn't just happen by itself. People talk about how relationships need work. The work doesn't necessarily mean it's a difficult thing. It's that kind of conscious realization of what you could be communicating about.